Welcome to Tea, Coffee, and Torah, episode 128. I'm Jodelle Onstott, and we are currently in the series, The Statutes of Life. Now, I am titling this one actually National Constitution and the Statutes of Life, because as we're going to see today, the idea of a national constitution, it enables the framework whereby life, society, everything that we hold dear in our modern physical world for it to thrive. But with Israel's constitution, it actually goes a little bit beyond that because it deals with things that make us healthy. It deals with obstacles to health by trying to eliminate them or to diminish them. It deals with everything that we need for a national thriving society to embrace liberty, to live where there is justice between our fellow man and between God. And more than that, Israel's constitution, unlike modern constitutions today, has a spiritual aspect. It actually speaks, it feeds, it protects the heart and the soul. It develops it so that we can go beyond the issues whereby we are always dealing with crime, we are always dealing with inequity, we're always dealing with oppression. So the idea is that when Israel's constitution is followed, it produces this self-sufficient, self-running, self-sustaining society that becomes very life-giving. So, one of the things that modern science and modern medical studies have discovered is that stress in life actually shortens your length of days. And we see this. People who have very stressful lives, who are maybe always dealing with divorce, constant divorces, or financial difficulties, or other issues. Hold on just a minute. I forgot to plug my laptop in here. I'm going to do that real quick. But when they face these issues, we find that their lives are shortened so that they do not live as long. As a matter of fact, Jacob tells us that his life was full of hardship and trouble. And because of that, he did not attain to the long lifespan as did Abraham or even Terah or his predecessors who, they lived 200 years or more. So stress in our environments, stress in our nations, even stress between nations, stress in our daily lives, the poisons and toxins we're exposed to, all of those shorten your lives. So what Torah does in this idea of the statutes of life is it gives Israel a constitutional framework. And we're going to delve into this a little bit deeper because I really want you to have a firm understanding of this. Last episode I asked, is the Torah a teaching or is it a law? And I presented that the Torah is a law primarily. It's a law in stone, etched in stone, like it's there. But that law is meant to teach. So they're not mutually exclusive, but rather a law always, when you get into, if you've ever taken a college class and you have taken a class with law or a class on government, or maybe you have read, like I have, a lot of ancient Near Eastern studies where you're dealing with the Hammurabi Code, you're dealing with a lot of these legal codes that are, have been prevalent among society at one time or another throughout history. Well, one of the things that you find all scholars agree upon is that a law, a national law, always has a moral component. It establishes what's right and what's wrong. Hammurabi establishes that if a engineer, a contractor builds a home and it's unstable, there's negligence and it collapses, well, if it harmed a life, it's life for life. So these are ideas of moral values that are meant to make our life better. They are meant to have a strong, stable society. So we're going to delve into this because today's statutes are a little bit challenging because they challenge our normal preconceived ideas of what we think national statutes should be. They challenge our ideas as to what we think creates life, because we're going to be exposed to some things that we've been taught to hate. We've been taught to denigrate them. We've been taught that everything associated with these statutes leads to death and not life. On the scholarly side, we're taught that these are late additions, Second Temple additions to the Torah, that they are by the priestly source, that they're man-made traditions and they're horrible. We should hate them. We shouldn't want anything to do with them. But do they? So we're going to delve into this. And along the way, I'm going to bring in some tad bits because I do want to set up this other series that I have coming that will probably follow this series as we get into biblical authorship. And that series is going to be termed the historical forensic approach to the documentary hypothesis, where we are going to take a forensic approach to the text. And we're going to see, number one, that the text actually tells us who many of us authors are, but we can also distinguish different hands in this. Now, the caveat here is that when most scholars see different hands in the text, they believe, and it is a belief, that it undermines the authority and validity of the text. But we're going to see that it actually does the exact opposite, that those different hands, when you understand that forensic, that study, it actually validates and it totally expunges the text because it shows it in its historical context, especially when you have words and terms and phrases that are maybe like popular around 1400 BCE, the exact same time that, Torah is being written by the scribes, it's being updated. And then all of a sudden those terms and phrases fall into disuse in later history. So there's no reason for a later scribe to dig up these old terms that have no relevance to his generation. But that's for our next day. Today, I want to get into the statutes of life and the idea of Torah as a constitution. And what we saw last time is that much of Exodus, I would probably say 95% of Exodus, comes before the book of Deuteronomy. We can see this, based on the verbs, based on the language that's used. Deuteronomy is reflective. It refers to the events that occurred in Exodus and Numbers as though they are in the past tense. We also find that Leviticus does the same thing. And we're going to see that a little bit more today. We're going to develop it a little bit more, where Leviticus will refer to something, and it is something that occurs. It is they're talking about it as though it's active in their day, but it's referring to something that was already established in Exodus, because Exodus was kind of like the record. Like if you have a scribe who records things as they occur, and then later on you're going to have a scribe that is going to take that original record and then transcribe it into the official record. And it appears that in the text, we have been blessed, for better or worse, to have retained both of those records. And it does allow us to see that unfolding of that development. And this is a process that is not unique to Israel. This would have worked. The same type of scribal process would have worked in ancient Egypt. It would have worked in China. And I will say, when you look at ancient China and their historical writings, oh my goodness, that is a great parallel to a lot of the writing techniques that probably functioned in ancient Israel. And a lot of this just comes down to necessity and common sense. I mean, if you're going to create an official historical record for your nation, you're going to have primary scribes that do the original grunt work. They're going to, record it in, it's happening. I'm going to write it down. And then later on, you're going to take that original text because it's going to be sloppy. It's going to be messy. That, your wording, your phrasing is going to be maybe not make sense to anyone else. So you're going to take that historical record and then you're going to put it, you will do some rewriting. You will do some redaction of your own work to put it into the official record so that it is something that is a quality product and that likely follows some standardized formulas that have been developed for your nation. Maybe there's a specific way of saying something. Maybe there's a specific phrase that you use to describe, a particular event or a particular person. We see this in Kings and Chronicles where it classifies a king. And at the very end, the scribe judges that king. And we're going to get into this a little bit later. It judges that king and says, this king did what was right, or this king did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. That really becomes a formatic phrase that is established throughout Israel's priesthood. But the importance of that is that there's this standard. They're not just saying this out of thin air, I'm using my own judgment. This is what I think. I think this king did righteous. I think this king did wickedly. No, what we find is that they're always judging the king based on a universal standard. And this universal standard is Israel's constitution. And what I want to, persuade you, I want to share with you, because it is just, I love it so much. Because over my studies, I really have, oh my goodness, just totally fallen in love with the entire law, even the parts that they offend our modern sensitivities, because I see something that is a structure that is so good, so healthy for society, and could change all of the controversies, the conflicts, the division that we have in society today. I see it very healing, and I want to share with you why that is. Number one principle that we find when we look at all the statutes, and remember, statutes are prescriptive and judgments are reactionary. So judgments come into play often when the Torah, the teaching, the Constitution has been breached. Now, a lot of those judgments, when we look at Exodus 21 through 24, they are predetermined, like theft. If you steal, or if someone steals, this will be the consequence that will follow. Doesn't mean that someone necessarily has committed the theft, but those judgments are there for the event that someone does violate the Torah. So, and here's another concept that I want you to really grasp. So the Torah does not embrace the idea of predestination. When we look at Deuteronomy 30, verse 16, verse 19, what does it say? Choose you this day. Choose you this day. Joshua says, choose you this day whom you will serve. In Joshua, 14, right around verses 15, I believe, or 20. But Joshua says, choose you this day whom you will serve. Moses says, I've set before you life and death, good and evil. Choose life. So in Torah, as well as Genesis 4:7, it says, sin lies at the door of your heart, but you can rule over it. So everything that we find in the Torah is a can-do religion. It is you have the ability to choose, you have the ability to do, and it's a very empowering way of life. And it totally prevents one or a society to falling into this black hole of victimhood where you feel absolutely powerless, as though you have no control over your destiny and over your future. So everything that we find in the Torah is choose, 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 choose. You can, you have the ability. That choice is in your hands. But here is the caveat, because if we choose to do what is right and we make that choice, then that outcome is predestined, because we have an outcome of blessings, of life, of health, of peace, of economic prosperity. So if we make that choice, the blessings are predestined. But by the same token, if we choose to reject God's law, even those statutes that we are very uncomfortable with today because they offend our modern sensibilities, even when we choose to violate, to rebel, to ignore, to put them in the waste bin, that is our choice. Well, we've had the ability to choose. There's nothing predestined about it. But Yahweh's consequences for those choices are predestined. And when you read Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26, we're told, You will face blight upon your crops. You'll face wars, famines, taxation, high taxation. Now, anciently, this would have been termed tribute. But, we find under King Solomon, he had horrific tribute throughout the land, or horrific taxation, so that it was very difficult. And they sought an easier way of life under his son Rehoboam. But all of these are consequences for breaching that original constitution. And the original constitution, and this does surpass, it goes beyond our modern, what we think are constitutional limits, because everything in Yahweh's constitution was preventative. It prevented disease, civil strife, foreign evasion. It protected your economy. It fostered an economy of wealth. It fostered national identity and national unity. Beyond that, it also enabled a country to expand, to grow. One of the things that we know just through studying history the last 2,000 years, and if you've listened to my previous episodes, I always use this as a great parallel because it is a great example. You go into a church or a synagogue. If everybody there is 60 plus years of age, 70 plus years of age, and you only have one or two people with families and small children, that church or synagogue will not exist in 10 years. In a decade, 15 years from now, it's going to be gone because you do not have the up and coming young people that are going to succeed you, take over the leadership, and keep that venue going. The same thing with a nation. When a nation is not growing, the population is not expanding so that you have young people coming in, and I mean qualified young people, not necessarily unqualified people, but they're able to supplant you righteously, take your place as you retire. When you don't have that, your nation's going to fracture. It's going to collapse. And that's what we're seeing in all of our Western society today is a population collapse. That's why the very first Abrahamic blessing, he says, go to a land that I will show you in Genesis 12. But that's not really the first blessing per se. The first blessing is I will make you a multitude of seed. Your seed will be as the sand of the seashore. Your seed will be as the stars of heavens, because it is in that population that you have military prowess, that you have economic viability. Again, your population either ensures an expanding economy or a contracting economy. And Yahweh delves with all of these issues in his national constitution. Now, the other thing that we saw last time was this micro division of leadership. Unlike our societies, can you imagine if you have an issue? Maybe there is something that occurs in your community. There's a concern. Maybe there's toxic waste. Maybe somebody is setting up surveillance, or it could even be the government that you are opposed to. You don't have to seek this representative that is representing, 20,000 people, 30,000 people. You go to your leader of 10. If it can't be solved there, and maybe it's a government issue, whether you're going to peel it up to 10, to 50, to 100, 1,000, 10,000, and you're going to keep going up that chain of command until you can find resolution. But notice what all of these indicate. All of these things that are in the written Torah are described. They are indicative of a national constitution. And the idea of a national constitution is that it becomes sealed. It becomes something that is judiciously protected against amendments. Now, let me just give you a classic definition of a national constitution. A national constitution is the fundamental supreme law of a country that establishes the structure of government, defines the power of its branches, such as legislative, executive, judicial, and guarantees the rights of its citizens. It serves as the supreme rule book, taking precedent over ordinary laws. So, and then sometimes you'll hear this also described as fundamental law, charter, framework for government, or supreme law. This is exactly what the Torah is. Now, I am going to be posting in the comments below after this, a great document that I encourage you to go read on your own. It has been published by Daniel Elazar, who served as President Reagan's advisor during the Reagan years. He established the Center for Jerusalem Center for Public Policy. And there is a great article in there called Deuteronomy as Constitution. But Israel's constitution really goes far beyond Deuteronomy because it embraces the entire Torah. And I want to introduce you to these concepts of constitution because as we go through the statutes today, the statutes of life, we are going to see these constitutional, again, this is common sense. This is logical constitutional law that we're going to see play out throughout the written Torah. So here's one constitution concept that you need to be familiar with. Explicit limits. Many constitutions contain eternity clauses that legally prohibit the amendment or removal of specific provisions. We're going to see some of these. And in Hebrew, it is called an olam or an olam da'or, meaning throughout your generations, forever, throughout eternity. We have many of these even in our own constitution because national constitutions are protected through rigid amendment process, judicial review, and high courts. And explicit unamendable clauses forbid changes to core principles, such as those that protect democracy and human rights. These frameworks often require supermajorities to ensure stability by preventing hasty partisan changes. And this is especially for the U.S., it requires a 2/3 majority. Now, the Torah is different than this because all of our modern constitutions that we have, whether it's a German, Argentina, U.S., Mexico, Iran, it really doesn't matter. Egypt, all of our modern day, even the state of Israel, all of our modern constitutions are man-made. They derive from man. So as we go through history, we are going to find situations, we're going to find events that come in conflict with what we once thought was a great precept or a great supreme law. We're going to find exceptions to it where, we got this wrong or this doesn't work out so well. Birthright citizenship is one of those issues where modernly, it was considered that, and it's debatable whether or not you came into the United States and you gave birth in the United States, that automatically meant that if the parents were nationals, citizens of, say, China or Russia, that automatically their child born in the United States has a right to citizenship based on being on U.S. soil. That is not a concept that the Torah embraced, by the way, because your parents always played a role as to who you are and the citizenship status that you held. That's another discussion for another time. So modernly, the U.S. Supreme Court is revisiting these ideas because this has been abused. It's been, it was open-ended, never necessarily clearly defined. But when you have Chinese nationals coming in for the Chinese government, or you have Russian nationals coming in for the Russian government, giving birth on U.S. soil, and then if by default their children are considered U.S. citizens, it provides those families, it provides China, which is a hostile actor, inroads to spy, for subversion, and a whole bunch of other tactics that are harmful to U.S. citizens. So these are ideas, but notice these are all man-made ideas. What we find in Torah is something totally different. There is not one claim anywhere between Genesis and Deuteronomy that anything in the Torah derives exclusively from man. Now, maybe Moses had an idea, maybe somebody else like and I'm going to massacre the name, but the daughters of Zeopold, maybe they had an idea. Hold on really quick. For some reason, my power isn't charging on my phone. Just a moment. Okay, hopefully that's charging now. I don't know. I guess I didn't set up my tech real well this morning. But what we find is that, there were different situations that could be brought to Moses, different situations that the Torah dealt with. But once those decisions were made, they became unamendable. They became set in stone. So they become eternity clauses, eternity provisions, many of them. So because, and this is where Israel's constitution differs from our modern constitutions, because it was divinely inspired, divinely revealed. And those aspects like Leopold's daughters, where there is a modern situation that is dealt with, because there's been a divine judgment on that situation and Yahweh has issued his decree, well, that becomes part of the Constitution. It's not like, oh, we can just go in and change it. So these are very important to understand. So let me give you a little bit more fuller definition of eternity clauses. Eternity clauses are provisions in a constitution that render specific parts of the constitution unamendable, serving as a stop line against democratic backsliding and constitutional dismantling. I mean, this prevents things that occur, in Soviet Russia, in Germany, where you just basically, you dismantle freedom of speech, dismantle gun rights, dismantle every step of the Constitution one by one piece at a time, so that it means absolutely nothing. It's not worth the paper that it's printed on, because you have dismantled it by whatever process you have created over the course of your nation. Maybe it's a tradition that has come about in the course of your nation. Because Torah is divinely revealed, it's protected against future amendments. It is perfect. You look at Psalms 19 verse 7. David proclaims that the written law, the written Torah, is perfect and is able to convert our hearts, our souls, and our minds when we follow its teachings. But these ideas, and we find in Deuteronomy 4:2 and 12:32, we find this statement that you shall not add to or diminish from the teaching, from the words, the physical black and white law, the statutes and judgments that Yahweh has revealed to Moses. So they become something that is etched, supreme law of the land, and they are unamendable. This protects democracy, because as we will see throughout this, there was a very much a strong role of the people's voice in Israel's ancient society. It wasn't like this authoritative top-down society where people were just held in subjugation to the leaders of the land. People actually had a very strong voice in who were elected as their leaders and in that process. But we find that these principles protect human rights, the functioning mechanisms of the overall government, so that the government that Yahweh put in place, where you have the leaders of tens, of hundreds, fifties, thousands, all of that, it can't be subverted. It can't be overthrown until Yahweh overthrows it as an act of judgment for Israel's historical oppression for not following the way of life that he gave them. Now, the other idea is that an eternity clause, it really limits, it becomes entrenched in your national constitution and in the provisions of your land, so that it can never, ever be legally amended. It is protected as core constitution identity, even when there is a majority that wants to change it. So this prevents later traditions, later, oral teachings, later ideologies from competing with, from supplanting, or from alienating the original concepts found in that law. Now, just for a little modern context, today around 35% of the world's constitutions, when we look at Brazil, Germany, India, Italy, about 35% of our modern constitutions have eternity clauses in them. So it's not so far-fetched now when we look at Israel's constitutions and we look at these statutes of life to see that they do provide many eternity clauses that are for olam. They are forever. And then it says through Da'or, throughout your generations, and they are not to be changed. Now, before we get into the nitty gritty today, I know it's taken me a long time to kind of set this up, But I really want you to have a firm grasp of this. I want you to have a very clear understanding, because the idea of a constitution really affects how we modernly grasp, how we modernly accept this document that is 3,000 years old and how we relate to it. So one of the other modern ideas that we have, first, we miss the boat when we don't think of the Torah primarily as a national constitution, because that is how we should think of it, is primarily as a national constitution. But the other fallacy that we have when we approach the Torah is that we hold every single law, every single statute, every single judgment, every single commandment in equal regard. In other words, everything's on the same plane. Everything's equal, so this is where you find the more modern concepts of you've broken one, you've broken them all. Well, no, that's not true. If you've committed theft, you have not murdered someone. Those are totally different. If you commit theft, you can become right again. You perform an asham where you make restitution. So you're going to pay 4 or 5 times the amount, make restitution to that person. And then you're going to come before the tabernacle. You will make a national restitution because you have polluted the morality, you've polluted the values, you have polluted the ideology, the philosophical ideas of the law of the land. And if that is not rectified, well, we're going to see what we see in America today, where theft is rampant, where it's so rampant that governments just simply catch and release. And the law has no teeth. It has no value because it really isn't followed. So this process kept Israel honest. But just because you committed theft did not mean you murdered someone. Murder was totally different. If you committed murder, there was no atonement that you could bring. There was no restitution. And like David, if that murder was not expunged by the hand of him who committed the crime, then it retains, as Nathan points out to David, a blight on your family household. And the blood guilt that David incurred for murdering Uriah, for committing adultery, it's inherited by your children. It stays, and we discussed this a little bit previously, like around episode 114, when we were talking about the sins of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generations, epigenetic curses, where that blood guilt is inherited by the house. This is why you find throughout the Torah, lest you bear guilt, lest the land bears blood, or lest the lamb bears blood guilt. And these are concepts we'll circle back around to later on. I don't want to get bogged down in that, but just be aware that these are all factors that contribute to our understanding. And because we've lost these concepts and ideas, we don't really, we lose the meaning and the heart and the strength of power of force of those statutes that enable life. So committing murder is not the same as committing theft. Theft, there is remedy. Murder, there is not. And if the judges of the land do not execute judgment on that house, well, then one of two things happen. Either that house and their descendants will bear that blood guilt, meaning that when you have 3 or 4 generations that continually rebel against Yahweh, well, then judgment will fall on that 3rd or 4th generation. And that 3rd or 4th generation will really have a hard time. If it's not wars, then there will be economic hardships. There will be something that occurs in those 3rd and 4th generation where people reap what they sow. And a lot of times, this is why in Deuteronomy 26, verse 40, it says that we confess our sins as well as the sins of our forefathers, because that is how we break that cycle. That is how we break that inheritance process, is when we repent and we return. But if you don't repent and return, then that judgment falls upon you and your generation. So with this understanding, the 10 Commandments are considered the law of the land. They are the supreme constitution. But the law of Moses, and we've looked at this previously, where Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, he spends 80 days with Yahweh, 40 days the first time, 40 days the second time. And during that time period, Yahweh teaches him his statutes and his judgments, which teaches Moses how to apply the national constitution to a real world living society. And there are divisions of legal code that we miss today. Commandments have the greatest force. Commandments are then subdivided into statutes and judgments that apply the law. But in with this, you can also have other commandments that can set their own precepts, and they won't contradict the Ten Commandments, but they'll still fall within one of those categories. Then you're going to have laws. Laws can set some sort of precedent, but they're not always eternal. They are something that may deal with a particular situation. And they are laws that definitely establish a religious philosophy, a religious ideology, but they are something that deal with unique situations, or maybe they're going to be what we found of Israel in the wilderness, where Israel had to do one thing in the wilderness, but then another way when they come into the land. And we do see quite a bit of that in the Torah, that you're going to do this when you're in the wilderness, but then when you come into the land, you're not going to do that anymore. You're going to do it this way. So it's really important that we understand the different categories of law, because it helps us to interpret and to understand that division of Hebrew law, as well as its form and its function. Genesis 26 verse 5, where Yahweh issues a covenant with Isaac, really gives us one of the clearest breakdowns of Hebrew law. And here we find that Yahweh says that he's renewing his covenant with Isaac for one reason and one reason only. Abraham had secured Yahweh's covenants, and they are to be passed down perpetually throughout Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob's generation. So Yahweh says that he gave his covenant because Abraham obeyed his voice. So this voice is kol. It would have been something that is physically audible, something Abraham would have heard. But then more than this, and we missed this word because we're going to develop this a little bit. It says that Moses kept his, I don't know why I'm saying Moses. Abraham kept his charge. Here the word for charge is mishmarti, and it's like a specific instruction. It's not necessarily something that's universal to all Israel. And we're going to see this with the Levites, because the same word is used for the Levites when they are giving their Levitical office as a duty or a job. It is a mishmarti, a specific charge, duty, job, or command. Well, Abraham receives that specific duty, charge, and command. I mean, he was told to leave Mesopotamia, the house of his fathers, to go to a land that Yahweh would show him. Abraham does all of these instructions, these commands that Yahweh gives him. Now, one of the things that you do find in the text, you do find that there is some like a synonym where mishmarti will be used versus zavah will be used, command, order, or charge. You do find that these two terms are used interchangeably. All right, sorry about that. My phone died. I had it charging earlier. Hopefully it will stay put and it will stay connected this time. I'll give you just a minute to migrate over. We are dealing with Genesis 26 verse 5 and the division of Hebrew law code. I will post this later so that way you can see. But yeah, it was my fault. I thought that my phone was charging during this whole process, and I guess I didn't push it in all the way and it died. And I do use my phone to record these sessions. All right, so I'm going to pick right back up in Genesis 26, verse 5. It says, Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge. Here's mishmarte, and a lot of times mishmarte is it's used as a synonym for zavah, which is a command, order, or charge. But he kept my mishmarte, my commandments, statutes, and laws. These are specific divisions of Hebrew law code. And we really do the Torah injustice when we try to make them one flat plane where they're just all the same, because they are not. And we're going to see, I don't know that we're going to get to it today, but in our next episode, we are going to see that there are some laws, some instructions that are only temporary. They're only for while Israel is in the wilderness, and they don't really come to play once Israel enters the land. So that's very important. The other thing that I want to show you is that this word mishmarti, I mentioned a moment ago in our other segment that the Levitical office is established by mishmarti, which is a specific charge or command. Now, this is very important because the Torah itself, the Constitution, is universal, but the mishmarti is not. The Levitical mishmarti is not universal. It is only for the Levites. It only applies to Levites. It does not apply to Judah. It does not apply to any of the 11 tribes. This is very important because what we're going to see in our future episode is that this mishmarti presents a huge obstacle under this generalized concept of Jesus fulfilling all the law. So we're going to, again, delve into that in another episode. But just tuck that away in in the back of your mind that one of the commandments, one of the instructions, one of the charges in Yahweh's constitutional law is that the Levites are established by mishmarti. They are established by a charge or by a responsibility, a duty. But as we're going to see, the only way you could fulfill that instruction is if you were a physical descendant from the male lineage within the house of Levi. But again, that's for next time. So statutes and judgments do derive from commandments. Laws also derive from commandments. They can establish a limited precedent, but they are usually not, in very rare cases, are they a bit along, something that is forever. They're usually limited. And I also want to remind you that so many times when we look at these issues, we get so focused when we look at the promise from Exodus 15:25 and 26, that if we obey all these statutes, judgments, and commandments that Yahweh has put before us, that he'll put none of these diseases upon us, that we miss what's stated in verse 25. And it says in verse 25 that Yahweh made for them a statute and a judgment, and there he tested them. So we can't remove the testing that Yahweh does from the other ties to Yahweh's statutes and commandments. So some of these may be in the law just to test us, just to see the willingness of our heart and the willingness of our mind in our willingness to do and to obey the law. Now, here's the final concept before we delve into some of the nitty gritty, and we'll probably just get into two of those today. But, and this is where the idea of statute challenges our modern understanding of constitution, our modern understanding of law and legal procedure. In the Mosaic Law Code, in Israel's national constitution, every single statute would at some point in time either bring you in contact with the sanctuary or in contact with a Levite. And this is a nuance that we don't find a parallel in any modern code. Because every single statute at some point in time brought you either to bring offerings to the temple, sacrifices. It brought, maybe you were sick and you needed to be cleansed. Well, then you would have to go to your local priest. Remember, every single tribe had 4 Levitical cities within its tribe. So you would go to your local Levitical city, kind of like your county seats, and you would seek their judgment on, am I clean? Am I unclean? As far as diseases are concerned, that Tomei and Tehor, that didn't really exist per se outside the temple proper, but disease did. That when it says if a house has blight, a creeping blight. And that is likely talking about black and red mold. That has nothing at all to do with the tabernacle, a temple. It has everything to do with disease and mold becoming something that is invasive to society, invasive to the human organism, whereby it enters your lungs and it causes all sorts of diseases, respiratory diseases from that toxicity of mold exposure. So just store in the back of your mind, because towards the end of the series, we're going to come back and I'm going to briefly go through, and I will list this on my academia page as well as a document that I'll upload, how every single statute brought you in contact with God. The statutes are actually key to a relationship with God. So these things that we have been taught to denigrate, the parts of the law that we say, oh, that was only for ancient Israel. We're too modern. We've progressed beyond that. If you want a relationship with God and you're not playing games with religion, you have to start with the statutes. So let me give you one statute that we're going to cover today. And I want you to read this on your own. So here's some homework. Go read Leviticus 18. Leviticus 18 contains Israel's morality code. Now, this is not something that is just a one-time thing. It's not just, it was for ancient Israel. No, this is for eternity. It is a way of life that enables us to avoid diseases. It enables us to avoid creating diseases because of conflicting in DNA that we pass down to our children, because it prohibits relationships that are harmful to children. Back in the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s, before you could get a marriage license, you actually had to do a blood test. You had to make sure that you weren't your spouse, your fiance's cousin. And because the law used to be very firmly upheld that you could not marry close relatives. And why is that? Well, modernly we have the Mendelssohn chart of inheritance. And what we know is that, and there's been Amish communities that have been studied. There have been some other early communities where they're very insular and they only marry within their particular clan, or they only marry within their particular family or extended family. And what we discover is that diseases, rather than becoming very recessive, where they are edited out of that genetic line because the pool is so great, you're drawing from other contributors. It rather becoming recessive, it becomes dominant. So this is why in some Amish communities, like entire family members began being born with 6 fingers. They began to have genetic heart diseases. They began to have all of these other genetic abnormalities because diseases that were introduced by violating Yahweh's law, rather than becoming recessive where they only appeared every so often and they could easily fall out of that community and be killed by no longer pulling from that gene pool, they became strong and they became something that was dominant rather than recessive. And then it ended that, sometimes it even ends that family line because they become impotent, because of the way that inheritance works. So Leviticus 18 limits the relationships that you can have. It is Yahweh's morality code. Your close relationships. You can't marry a sister, a brother, an aunt, an uncle, a father, mother. Those types of relationships are all forbidden because incest, not only is it psychologically harmful and spiritually harmful, but it also produces disease, which then harms the community. So Leviticus 18, notice what it says in 18:26-30. And this is how we know that Yahweh's morality code is a statute, because at the end of all of what he says about this is an abomination, if something is an abomination to Yahweh, it's not like it's going to be an abomination 3,000 years ago. And then all of a sudden today it's been washed and made clean and it's okay. If an abomination is something that is grotesque, it is revolting, it is wicked. And if something is wicked, It cannot all of a sudden be condoned, be righteous, and be okay today. This also includes relationships between men and women and women. Those types of relationships, the blank sex, are prohibited. They are an abomination, and that doesn't change just because we're separated by 3,000 years. So this is how we know that Yahweh's morality code is a statute. Verse 26, you shall therefore keep my statutes, it's named here as a statute, and my judgment, and shall not commit any of these abominations, neither of your own nation, nor any stranger that dwells among you. And so many times, and this is often ignored because there are some people that want to view Israel's constitution as exclusive. Well, back at the time Israel was established, the only nation that wanted to follow Torah was Israel. And even they didn't even want to follow that constitution because they wanted to give in to their own lusts and their own depravity. But we find that anyone living on Israel's land had to follow this universal constitution. Everyone was held to the same accountability. So the ger, anybody who dwelled in Israel's land is held to this same standard. But notice the judgment, because here we've been given the statutes. The statutes these are healthy relationships. These are unhealthy relationships. These are what is permissible. This is what's not. But then in verse 27, we have this clarification. For all the nations have done this, that I am casting out before you. Therefore, the land is defiled. So Yahweh is saying here that, and I know a lot of texts view this as an addition, but this could be a very primary text to the original text because it provides a very important clarification that the land had become defiled because because the Canaanites had given into incest. So what can we expect? The Canaanites likely had diseases. They likely had not recessive diseases, but dominant diseases that were passed down generation to generation, that were ending their family lines, that were making them physically weak, economically weak, and very vulnerable to their enemies. But notice here is the judgment. So if you are going to ignore the statutes that are listed for healthy family relationships from Leviticus 18 verses 1 through 26. If you're going to ignore those, well, here's the judgment. And this is the judgment in verse 28, that the land spew you not out also when you defile it, as it spewed out the nations before you. So the judgment here is that if you are going to commit incest in your land, Yahweh is going to judge you, and the land will spew you out. We see this with the 4 deportations of northern Israel, the 4 deportations of Judah, southern Israel, where they are spewed out of the land and they are carried away into Assyria and Babylon into captivity. Verse 29, whoever shall commit of these abominations, even that soul that commit among them shall be cut off from among their people. So this idea of being cut off from among your people, it is where you no longer have access to the voice of Israel's voting congregation. You basically lose your voice in the nation to exercise your constitutional representation if you violate these commands. It doesn't mean necessarily that you're put to death. You are in some cases, but not in all. Verse 30, therefore you shall keep my charge. Here the word again is mishmaret, that you may not commit any one of these abominations which were committed before you, that you do not defile yourselves in it. I am Yahweh your God. So this is represented as being given directly by Yahweh. It is a teaching, but it's also a law that teaches us healthy relationships. And the judgment in this is that if we don't obey it, well, then Yahweh will spew us off the land. So one of the things when this discussion comes up that is often mentioned is that, well, Abraham married his half-sister, or even Cain. Cain would likely have had to marry his sister if they were the only people that were created on the land. And it is very possible that in very early history, remember Abraham is only something like, is it 1,200 years from creation? I mean, it's not very long. But in very early history, probably all the genetic code was so compact that you actually could have married a half sibling, or you could have married a cousin, and it didn't produce the diseases and the dominant recessive genes. So what occurred for Abraham 430 years later, the families had become segregated enough, they had intermarried enough within their own clans that it was no longer healthy to marry a half sister. The other thing that we find, the other custom, is that in ancient Egypt, where Israel is coming out of, the pharaohs had this long history of marrying the siblings. This kept the wealth within that core family of the pharaoh. It kept the power, the authority within the power of the family when Pharaoh married his sister. But the other thing that it did that we have now found, like there's inscriptions that we find of like Hatshepsut and some of the other Egyptian pharaohs, where they had disease. And some of these were genetic diseases, and it was because they were always marrying their siblings. The other thing that we find is that Yahweh does not necessarily want this concentrated power to all be in one family. Rather, as with the law and the Constitution, where it established very, very local judges and magistrates over tens, 50s, hundreds, thousands, that's very local, and that is very much a diffused and dispersed power. So it's limited power, but it's dispersed throughout society, so that even if you have a strong centralized government, it is so limited in what it can do, because the real power is really at the grassroots. It's at the local level. So all of these come into play when we look at Yahweh's statutes. And these statutes of life enabled Israel to become a very strong society, to be a society where there was no disease. So notice the morality code of Leviticus 18 is preventative. It prevents genetic diseases from entering into society, or at least one way in which they can enter into society. Next time, we are going to delve into the statutes of life regarding the Levites, the Tabernacle, and the Temple. The parts of the law that we have been taught, we've been gaslit to say they're out of date, they're horrible. Most of us have even been taught to think of these as wicked. But are they? Have we inherited these lies modernly? Have we been taught to believe and to think this way because there's other agendas that are competing against and competing for these ideologies? Because these statutes, they don't just establish a way of life. They also establish a healthy, robust, I-can-do theology, and it prevents other lies from creeping into Yahweh's pure religion, Yahweh's pure ideology. We're going to delve into that more next time as we get into the function, the meshmerati of the Levites, of the priesthood, of the tabernacle and temple, because it is the tabernacle, temple, and Levites that contain more statutes than any other part of the law. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. I've enjoyed our time together. And do remember, if you're just catching this episode, I forgot to charge my phone. It's on me, or I thought it was plugged in and it wasn't. So go back and catch that episode 128A, so that they do go together. Thank you so much for joining me today. From my home to yours. Shalom.